I was at a dinner party a few months ago with several clinicians and academics, and the subject of misophonia happened to come up because clinicians and academics. Besides, how else can you make everyone feel painfully self-conscious before your server brings the food out to the table than to mention a disorder in which people are driven half mad by the sound of other people chewing? And as it would happen, about half the people at the table volunteered that they, in fact, suffered from some problems with misophonia, which made me want to ask for my food to go because I had no intentions of eating dinner without chewing. What you may want to notice about this book, however, Does the Sound of Others Chewing Fill You with Rage?, is not only that the problem has become so common that someone felt like they had to write a book about it, but that more disturbingly, this is the second edition. Because Thomas Dozier felt like he had more to say about the subject. But what I want to draw your attention to, and honestly the only reason that I bring up misophonia at all, is the subtitle, Understanding and Overcoming Misophonia. Everybody I know has issues. Some triggers, yeah, you too, Mark. Some tics, some neurotic or compulsive or mental quirk of some sort, if not a full-blown mental illness. About 1 in 5 people in the world, half of all dogs and virtually all cats, have some degree of mental illness. I kind of wish I was joking about this, but Reconcile is the veterinary version of Prozac, which is to be given to dogs, mostly dogs that have to live with cats. This is not me. This is veterinary science. Now, no one on earth gets to be held up as a role model of mental health. Everyone has issues. But where I really struggle, both as a pastoral counselor and as a person who is interested in both spirituality and psychology, is at this crossroads of naming disorders so that you put them on your personal list and working hard to overcome them. I get that the sound of chewing bugs some people, and some people it irritates a lot. And I get that there are degrees of irritation at various forms of public manners, not just table manners, but manners in general. But I'm really glad that the subtitle of the second edition of the book about misophonia talks about getting over it, rather than simply naming it and making it a part of how you control your environment. All such social affectations can become like a bar in a prison, and if you keep naming and adding your triggers, you end up putting yourself in a cage. The number one source of suffering in the modern world is loneliness, and unfortunately, a great deal of it is self-imposed. Most of what causes suicide, most of what causes addiction, most of what causes depression is social isolation. Why, on a planet with billions of people, is anyone socially isolated? And there are lots and lots of reasons to talk about social isolation, but what I'm wanting to address today is the self-imposed kind. When you make a decision that you're going to let an irritant become a permanent fixture in your life. You identify the problem, you try to understand it, and I think all of us have to decide that we're going to work towards overcoming it. As a kid growing up in rural Kentucky, I ate sausage fairly regularly at breakfast until I had to help make it. And after being a part of the process of slaughtering hogs and the 4 children in my family sitting around a giant tub where you just reach in and work the ground meat and the seasonings together. It was some years after that before I ate sausage, but I am proud to announce that I have overcome that. I got food poisoning from bad fish one day. In fact, I've often said that the most important thing I learned at Harvard was not to eat the sushi in the little plastic box in the refectory. And it was a long time before I could eat sushi again, but I got over it. I grew up in the rural South with all kinds of irrational prejudices about race, about foreigners, about other religions, but I got over it, or I am getting over it. I was reared in a fairly, for the community I guess, a fairly academic and progressive Christian church, but still biblical literalism was just in the air, it was in the water. I grew up in an evangelical conservative context, and I got over it. I am so glad that I didn't just stay in the prison, the cage that was prepared for me in my early rural childhood, that you recognize that, yeah, this is what my grandparents believed. Yes, this is what my parents believed. Yes, this is what the neighbors believed. And they were all wrong. And I don't have to live in that mental prison. In philosophy, we talk a lot about causality. You may not hear much talk about that because no one talks to philosophers. But I wish that psychology would strive to consider causes more carefully. Proximity of events does not mean that one made the other one happen. But more importantly, there are reasons for certain mental illnesses. There are reasons for personal triggers. But a reason and a cause are not the same thing. You may have reason to have turned out a particular way, but it didn't make you. You get to make choices. My clinical work in grad school was primarily with addiction, a problem that has only become much more profoundly serious since I got out of school. In recent years, death from opioid addiction has gone over 60,000 people a year. Unbelievable. It's the entire Vietnam War every year. It was not uncommon when I was running the intake groups at the Veterans Hospital at Vanderbilt, where I did my clinical work in my doctoral program, that these new guys that came in once a week and we would do the intake interviews, someone would say, well, my dad was a drunk, and I'm a drunk, and my kid is a drunk. And sure, family of origin can be the cause of a lot of addiction and issues. My parents were absolute teetotalers, and I got to tell you, a bottle of wine would have helped out a number of Thanksgiving conversations. But I would ask about other family members. Do you have aunts and uncles who are not drunks? Do you have siblings who are not drunks? Are all of your kids drunks, or do you have some that didn't turn out to be drunks? In my experience, if an alcoholic had 3 children, one was likely to become an alcoholic, one was likely to become a fundamentalist rabid teetotaler, and the third would spend the rest of their life wondering why their 2 siblings were completely nuts. Alcoholism does run in families, and we can run the numbers on the disease and predict with fair accuracy what the general outcomes are going to be. About 1 in 10 people in the United States have a problem with alcohol abuse. But if you grew up in a home with an alcoholic parent, your chances of being alcoholic double. And in those sad cases where both parents are alcoholics, your chances of being an alcoholic doubles again. What came to frustrate me in working in this field is that I only saw the 1 in 5 or the 1 in 2 that had become an alcoholic. And I know that the family of origin gives lots of reasons for addiction, but it can't be a cause because only 1 in 5 became an alcoholic. What was different for the other 4? A kid growing up in a a drug crime infested neighborhood is much more likely to become involved in drug-related crime. But all of the kids in the neighborhood don't become drug dealers. Kids in failing schools are much more likely to end up in prison. The school-to-prison pipeline in several parts of our country, particularly in large cities, is a thing. It's a very real thing. But what happened differently in the lives of the kids who emerged from those failing schools to be personally successful? Most of what we know about this is good mentoring, good connections, strong social connections seems to make the difference. If having an alcoholic parent caused my clients to become alcoholics, then all of the people who grew up in that household should have become an alcoholic. And the fact of the matter is that 80% of them don't. There are reasons, but you have to be very careful about assuming that a reason is necessarily a cause. They are not the same things. You may have reasons for some of your issues. They may emerge from your family of origin or for some trauma, but other people experienced the same thing and did not come out with the same disorders. Now, psychology is anything but an exact science. There's a great deal of scientific research that does go on in the field, and we've learned a lot about the complexity of the human psyche. But I think that physicists know more about dark matter than psychologists know about mental illness. And a physicist will tell you in a heartbeat that they know nothing about dark matter except for the fact that they're pretty sure that it exists and they're pretty sure that it composes most of the universe. Kind of a sad commentary on being a physicist in a way, isn't it? But very similar, few things are more important than mental health. It's like the dark matter of the universe. We know that there are lots of issues, but we don't seem to know very much about them. Now, if you see a therapist, somewhere in their office you'll see this book hanging out, the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's kind of like a catalog of mental affect, and I keep looking at the Guinness Book of World Records to see if I'm referred as the only person that's dated someone off of every page of that book. Next slide. It suddenly got personal. This book was written by a friend of mine, Paula Kaplan, a former Harvard professor, and was actually a founding member of our church. Her family is from Springfield, and she was living here when we started the church. Paula wrote this book about the DSM, pointing out that there is virtually no science in it at all. The DSM is put together by an influential group of psychiatrists that meet once a year, and they, among themselves, decide who is mentally ill and who is normal. And, you know, they've been through 5 versions of it now, so that kind of proves Paula's point all by itself, doesn't it? In the first DSM, being a homosexual was a diagnosable mental illness. Now, being homophobic is diagnostic criteria for several different kinds of mental disorders, yes. So we can be glad that they changed their minds about a number of things. I just think that we all have to kind of step back and hold a little skeptical reserve about the worlds of medicine, psychology, and especially psychopharmacology. I think we are smart to be suspicious that the whole story hasn't been written yet, and the whole story won't be in the DSM-6, which is scheduled to come out relatively soon. I don't want to disparage the whole world of the field of identifying and cataloging and researching mental illness, but I do want to suggest this corrective. I desperately want everyone to think more about mental health than about mental illness. I want to spend more time talking about what we can do to make ourselves more healthy rather than trying to medicate away or to spend an hour a week talking about how depressed that we are. Now, we've spent a lot of time over the last generation trying to figure out if mental illness comes from our inherent nature from birth or if it is actually a result of environment. I'm an adoptive father, so I've always assumed that any irritating thing about my daughter's character was a matter of nature and that all of her positive attributes were a part of nurture. But clearly, both play a role. If there is any field in which there is more uncertainty than there is in psychology or in physics, it has to be neurology. Honestly, sometimes I think neurologists are brazen just to cash their paychecks. They don't know much about how the human brain actually works. The brain is shrouded in mystery, and we have devoted huge amounts of effort to trying to figure out why certain disorders appear at certain stages of life or work out in certain ways, and what can we do to help children to become happy and productive adults. And, you know, we've all known of family systems where it looked like the parents did everything wrong and the kids turned out great, and others where the parents appear to have done everything right and the kids had any number of problems. We just don't know that much about neurology yet. It's apparent that both nature and nurture are at work, but what is equally obvious is this, and this is what I really want you to go home thinking about today. No one is happy. No one is mentally stable. No one is leading a fulfilled, successful life if they have not adamantly chosen to work towards those things. No one gets there by accident. Good marriages don't just happen. Happy lives don't just fall out of heaven. Mental health is fairly rare, but it is a choice to reject other options. One of my favorite people in the world is a little 10-year-old son of some friends of mine. And I've known Jack since he was in diapers. And I've been involved with the dawning realization that Jack is not just a bit quirky and train obsessed, but he is in fact on the autism spectrum. Jack's always had issues with foods, something I learned. I was taking care of the kids at their home once a few years ago, and even though I made the traditional Southern breakfast of country ham, scrambled eggs, grits, and fried potatoes, Jack insisted on having a Pop-Tart. I was hurt. But Jack let out a blood-curdling scream when he saw me put his Pop-Tart into the toaster and turn it on. He cannot stand for them to be heated up. He has to have them, as he says, raw. His food issues continue to evolve so that now he cannot stand for his foods to touch one another. And I had taken the family out to a restaurant over the summer, and I explained to the waitress, I'm going to tip you generously for the trouble, but I need for you to bring Jack's food out on separate plates. I need the hot dog on one, and the French fries on one, and the mac and cheese on another, because Jack cannot eat food that has touched each other. So the waitress, unfortunately, brings out this very large plate with each of the foods scooted to the side, but to Jack's eyes, that was too close for comfort, and he simply couldn't eat any of it. And this is what endeared me to Jack for the rest of his life. He looked up at his mother and he said, "You know I don't want to be this way." Bingo. He is not using his issues to control his environment, the people around him, or even his theologian surrogate grandfather who stupidly puts toaster pastries into a toaster. Which means I get to have country ham, eggs, grits, and a hot Pop-Tart. He has issues, but they are not issues of his own choosing. But as the book I mentioned a few minutes ago suggests, he will come to understand and overcome these issues because Jack did not choose this prison of trigger issues, and I am confident that he will not live behind those bars. What I want for Jack, what I want for me, and what I want for you is to not let reasons for our challenges in life to become causes. I want you to reject the bondage of ways of thinking that have become bars that hold us tightly into behaviors that make us lonely, that isolate us, that rob our lives of joy and meaning, and that keep us thinking about illness rather than thinking about health, or thinking about weakness instead of strength, or failure instead of success, or acquiescence rather than freedom. My favorite saying from all those addiction meetings I had to attend when I worked at the VA is just this: don't tell me how sick you've been, tell me how well you want to be.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.